For as long as he could remember, the man had dreamed of being a musician, standing in front of thousands of people and pouring his heart out through his songs. But life hadn't been kind to him. Instead of performing on grand stages, he found himself playing on the sidewalk, hoping someone would stop long enough to listen. His music was all he had left. When he was younger, he imagined that fame and fortune would come easily, that people would recognize his talent, but reality was far different. Each morning he woke up early, grabbed his guitar and walked to his usual spot on the busy street corner. The crowd didn't notice him. People were too caught up in their own lives to care about the man with the guitar. The noise of traffic, the clatter of people rushing to their destinations drowned out his music. Yet he played every day, believing that someone somewhere would hear him and understand. The street was always crowded. People hurried past without so much as a glance in his direction. He didn't blame them. Life in the city was fast, and most were too busy to pay attention to the man on the corner. But the man didn't mind. He didn't need fame or recognition. He just needed the music. It was the only thing that made sense to him, the one constant in his life when everything else seemed uncertain. He didn't care if anyone stopped to listen. He played because it was the only way he could express himself. Each song was a piece of his soul. His fingers strummed the guitar with a rhythm that spoke of years of practice, of the hardships he'd faced. His voice carried the weight of everything he had been through, from the sleepless nights to the days when he felt like giving up. But no matter how tired or frustrated he became, he couldn't stop. He couldn't stop singing. There were days when he felt invisible, like he was just another person in a sea of faces. But even on those days, he kept going. He sang songs about love, loss, and longing, songs that were meant for someone even if no one was there to hear them. He played for the dream of someday being heard, someday being seen for who he really was. The man had learned early on that he couldn't rely on anyone else to make his dreams come true. The people who had promised to help him along the way had long since disappeared, so he took matters into his own hands, trusting only himself to keep going. And so he sang. Despite the lack of attention, there was something comforting about the routine. He knew where to stand, which spot would give him the best chance of being seen. He knew the times when the foot traffic would be heavy, and the times when he'd be left alone with just the sound of his guitar. Sometimes he'd make a few dollars in tips, but it wasn't much. Still, it was enough to keep him going. It wasn't that he didn't want more. He dreamed of playing in a grand venue, with lights shining down on him and an audience cheering him on. He dreamed of writing songs that would be remembered for years to come. But for now, he was content with what he had, his guitar, his voice, and the music that kept him grounded. There was a small part of him that wondered if anyone had ever noticed him, if someone had ever stopped long enough to listen to his songs and think, this person has something special. But even that was a fleeting thought, something he pushed away quickly. He didn't need anyone's approval. The music was enough, and so he sang. Day after day, he played his heart out on the street corner, hoping that one day someone would stop and hear the passion in his voice. Someone would stop and understand. Little did he know. That day was closer than he realized. As he sang one afternoon, his fingers moving expertly over the strings of his guitar, he noticed a couple of people stop to listen. They didn't seem to be in a hurry like the others. They stood there for a while just watching him. He didn't know if they were impressed or just curious, but they were the first to give him any attention in days. He smiled at them, his voice growing stronger with the recognition. The man had played here so many times, and the crowd's indifference had become a familiar feeling. But that afternoon, something was different. The few people who had stopped to listen were hanging on to every note, swaying gently to the rhythm. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep his spirits high. He played with more energy, singing louder, letting his emotions flow into the music. It was a good feeling to be heard, even if it was just for a few minutes. He didn't know if the people standing there were going to remember him or his song. But for the briefest moment, he felt like he mattered. He finished the song and gave them a small nod, ready to pack up and leave for the day. But just as he was about to turn away, one of them pulled out a phone. They were recording him. The man froze for a moment, unsure of what to make of it. He had seen people record street performers before, but it always felt a bit strange. He didn't think much of it, though. It was just another passerby capturing the moment on their phone. After they finished recording, they walked off, blending back into the crowd as if nothing had happened. But the man couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just occurred. Maybe it was nothing, or maybe it was the beginning of something bigger. As he packed up his guitar, he caught a glimpse of the time. It was getting late and the sun was beginning to set. The crowd was starting to thin out and he knew it was time to go. He walked home, his mind wandering. What would tomorrow bring? Would it be another quiet day on the street corner, or would something finally change? Unbeknownst to him, that recording would be the spark that ignited his journey. But for now, all he had was the music and the hope that someday someone would hear him. The man awoke the next morning like any other day, with the familiar sense of uncertainty hanging over him. His guitar sat by the door waiting for him to pick it up and start the same routine he had followed for so long. But today felt different, and he couldn't quite put his finger on why. The events of the previous afternoon were still in the back of his mind, the memory of those few people who had actually stopped to listen. It wasn't much, but for him it was a spark, a tiny glimmer of something more. He made his way to his usual spot on the street corner, the place that had become both a sanctuary and a reminder of his long struggle. It was where he'd spent countless hours, playing and singing without expecting anything in return. He wasn't sure what had changed, but something about today felt like it might be the start of something new. As he set up his guitar and strummed a few chords, his mind wandered to the previous day. He remembered the couple who had stopped to listen. They had looked like they were in a rush, but something had made them stay. It wasn't much, just a few minutes of their time, but it was enough to spark a feeling deep within him. Maybe, just maybe, someone out there was starting to notice him. He shook off the thought. It didn't matter. He didn't need to worry about who was listening. What mattered was that he was doing what he loved. That was enough for now. Still, the thought of someone paying attention, someone recording his performance, kept tugging at the back of his mind. He played through his set, each song flowing naturally from his heart. The city was alive around him, with people rushing past, each person lost in their own world. But every so often someone would pause. A glance, a look of curiosity, a brief moment where they would stop, listen, and then continue on their way. It wasn't much, but it was more than he had received in a long time. The man didn't expect much from the people who walked by. They were just trying to get to their destinations, just like he had been not too long ago. But when someone actually seemed to take notice, it gave him a renewed sense of purpose. He played with more energy, his fingers moving faster, his voice rising higher. He poured himself into the music as if each note was an offering to the world. But as the hours passed, the crowd thinned. He wasn't surprised. It always happened. People had places to be, and he was just another street performer. He gathered his things and began to pack up, not thinking much of the day. It had been another quiet afternoon, another routine, nothing special. It wasn't until he got home and checked his phone that he noticed something strange. A notification popped up, a message from someone he didn't know. It was a simple comment, "Is this you?" Along with the message, there was a link. Curious, he clicked on the link. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. It was a video, his video, posted online. The couple who had stopped to listen the previous day had shared a recording of his performance. He had no idea they were filming him. But there it was, right in front of him. His face, his guitar, his voice captured in a moment that now belonged to the world. He stared at the video, a mix of emotions rushing through him. There he was, playing on the street corner, singing his heart out. His voice sounded raw but real. There was something powerful about it. As he watched the video, he could see the emotion in his own eyes. He could hear the truth in his voice. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. He scrolled down the page to read the comments. They were all positive. People were praising his voice, his talent. Some were even asking for more music, asking where they could hear him next. It was overwhelming. He hadn't expected this. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. He had spent so long in the shadows singing for only a handful of people, if that. But now there were thousands of eyes on him. The video had gone viral. It was everywhere. The comments kept coming in faster and faster. People from all over the world were watching him. Some left encouraging words. Others said they had been moved by his performance. He had no idea what to do with all this attention. It felt strange, almost unreal. At first he thought it was a fluke. Maybe it would die down. Maybe the attention would fade, and he could go back to his quiet life of playing on the street. But as the hours passed, the video kept getting shared. More people commented. More people took notice. It was impossible to ignore. Soon his phone buzzed again. This time it was an email. It was from a talent scout, a real talent scout, someone who worked for a record label. The message was brief. "We saw your video. We'd like to talk to you about a potential opportunity." He couldn't believe it. Was this really happening? He read the email again, making sure he hadn't missed anything. It was real. It was happening. His mind was spinning. Was he ready for this? Was this the chance he had been waiting for? He had dreamed of something like this for years, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure if he was ready. He was just a man with a guitar. He had no connections, no real experience in the industry. He had only ever played on the streets, but that didn't matter. The truth was, he didn't need to be ready. He had something more important. He had the music. That was enough to get him started. The next few days were a blur. He received messages from more talent scouts, more people in the music industry, who had seen the video and wanted to talk. It felt surreal. The man had spent years playing for no one, and now suddenly, people were reaching out to him. The attention didn't stop there. More people began showing up on the street corner to listen to him play. He noticed them standing on the sidewalk, watching him with rapt attention. Some had their phones out recording. He felt like an imposter at times. He wasn't used to being noticed, to being the center of attention, but he couldn't deny the excitement that surged through him. He was starting to feel like something was changing. He didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of something bigger. Maybe he wouldn't have to sing on the streets forever. Maybe, just maybe, he was about to live the dream he had always imagined. As the days passed, the man kept playing. He kept singing. His voice carried farther than it ever had before. He was no longer just a street performer. He was someone people were beginning to listen to. And he was ready to see where it would take him. It didn't take long for the man to realize that his life was about to change in ways he never imagined. After the video of his performance went viral, everything seemed to happen at once. Talent scouts, producers, and record labels started contacting him, offering opportunities he had only dreamed about. It felt unreal, as if he was living someone else's life. But it was his life, and he had to figure out what to do with it. The first few calls were overwhelming. He'd never been in the music industry before. He had always played on the streets, for people who passed by, people who didn't expect anything in return. Now he was being asked about contracts, music videos, and studio recordings. The questions seemed endless, and he struggled to keep up with it all. But the one thing he knew for sure was that he didn't want to lose what made his music real. He didn't want to become someone else's version of what a musician should be. He had always played from the heart. The songs he sang on the street were filled with emotion, raw and unfiltered. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply expressing what was inside of him. That had always been enough. But now people were listening, and they wanted more. The man knew that this was his chance to step into a world he had only ever dreamed about. But as exciting as it was, there was a part of him that was scared. He didn't want to lose the connection he had with his music, the one that made him feel alive. The street corner where he sang without any expectations was where he felt most at peace. But now he was being offered a chance to perform on much bigger stages. It was everything he had ever wanted, and yet it felt like there was so much at stake. One afternoon, as he sat in his small apartment, the phone rang again. It was a representative from one of the biggest record labels. The man took a deep breath before answering, his heart racing. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this kind of conversation. But there was no turning back now. The voice on the other end was warm and professional, asking him about his plans, his vision, and what kind of music he wanted to make. It was a far cry from the casual conversations he had with strangers on the street. The man felt the weight of the moment, realizing that this wasn't just about singing anymore. This was about building a career, a future, and possibly even a new life. The representative spoke about how they had seen the video of his performance and how it had caught the attention of their team. They believed he had something special, something that could reach millions of people. It was flattering to hear, but it also made him feel like he was stepping into something much bigger than he had ever imagined. The man had never considered himself a star. He was just a person with a guitar, singing because he loved it, but now it seemed like he was on the verge of becoming something more. And with that came the pressure to succeed. As the call ended, the man sat in silence for a moment, absorbing everything that had just happened. He had always been content with the simple act of singing in front of a small audience, playing for the people who walked by. But now, there was this world of possibility opening up before him, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to take it on. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. The man flew to meetings, signed contracts, and recorded his first studio songs. Each step felt like a leap into the unknown, but it also felt like he was finally finding his place in the world. The studio was different from anything he had experienced before. It was clean, polished, and filled with expensive equipment, but as he sat in front of the microphone, he realized that the most important thing hadn't changed. His voice, his music, was still the same. The first song he recorded was one he had written years ago, a song he had always loved but never thought would be heard by anyone other than the few people who passed by on the street. But now it was being recorded in a professional studio, ready to be shared with the world. As he sang, he felt the same connection to the music that he had always felt, but this time it was different. There was a sense of urgency in his voice, as if he was trying to tell the world something important. This wasn't just about making music anymore. This was about sharing a piece of himself with the world. When the song was finished, the producer listened to the playback, nodding in approval. The man could tell they were impressed, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It wasn't that the recording wasn't good, it was. But it felt different from the rawness of his street performances. There was a polished quality to it, something that made it feel less real. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew he needed to find a way to bring that raw energy back into his music. Over the next few months, he spent more time in the studio, recording more songs, but still something felt off. He was doing everything that was expected of him, working with producers, making connections in the industry, but the music didn't feel like his. It wasn't that he didn't like it. It just didn't have the same power as when he played on the street. The songs were good, but they didn't carry the same weight, the same emotion. One night, after another long day in the studio, the man returned to his apartment feeling exhausted and frustrated. He sat on the couch looking out the window at the city lights. The streets were still alive, bustling with people, and he couldn't help but think about the days when he played for the few people who passed by. He missed the simplicity of it all, the feeling of being completely present in the moment without worrying about what others expected of him. He grabbed his guitar and walked out to the balcony. The cool night air felt refreshing against his skin as he strummed a few chords. For a moment, he allowed himself to forget everything. The contracts, the studio sessions, the pressure. He just played. It was in that moment under the city lights that he realized something important. He couldn't lose himself in the process. No matter how big the stage or how many people were listening, he had to stay true to the music that had brought him here in the first place. The next day, he went back to the studio, but this time, things were different. He walked in with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to bring the rawness of his street performances into the recordings. The producers were a little taken aback at first. It was a bold move, but the man didn't care. This was his music, and it had to sound like him. He was no longer just a performer trying to please others. He was an artist who had something to say. As the days turned into weeks, the man found his balance. He recorded songs that were true to himself, songs that captured the emotion and energy he had always brought to his street performances. The music felt real again. It felt like something he could be proud of, something that would connect with people in the way his street performances had. The man's journey wasn't over yet. There were still many obstacles ahead, still many challenges to face. But for the first time since he started, he felt like he was on the right path. He wasn't just singing for an audience, he was singing for himself. And that, he realized, was what truly mattered. The man's life had changed in ways he never thought possible. From the streets to the studio, from performing for a few people to signing contracts with record labels, everything had happened so quickly. He was still getting used to the idea that this was his reality now. He was no longer just a street performer. He was a recording artist with a career on the rise. But even with all the success and the excitement, something kept nagging at him. The transition from singing on the streets to performing on big stages felt like a leap he wasn't quite ready for. Sure, he had been dreaming of this moment for years, but now that it was here, it didn't seem as simple as he had imagined. The first time he stepped on a real stage, the size of the crowd took him by surprise. He had been used to performing for a handful of people on the sidewalk. People who passed by dropped a few coins and kept moving. But now, as he looked out over the sea of faces in the audience, it was overwhelming. There were so many people, hundreds, even thousands, staring at him, waiting for him to perform. His heart raced in his chest. The lights were bright, almost blinding, and the sound of the crowd was deafening. He had never experienced anything like this before. The stage was massive, with giant speakers on either side, and the feeling of being under the spotlight was both exciting and terrifying. He tried to calm his nerves, telling himself that this was what he had always wanted. But the doubt crept in. What if they didn't like his music? What if he froze up in front of them? What if he couldn't live up to the expectations everyone had for him? The first few notes were shaky. His fingers fumbled on the strings of his guitar and his voice cracked as he sang. The crowd seemed to sense his nerves, but they didn't judge. Instead, they cheered him on, offering their support with every word, every note. Slowly, he began to find his rhythm. The music that had always been a part of him started to flow naturally again. With each song, the tension eased and he began to feel at home on the stage. But even as he gained confidence, there was still a part of him that struggled with the overwhelming nature of it all. He had spent so many years singing in the streets in a space where he could be himself without any expectations. The stage, with its bright lights and loud sounds, felt different. He had to constantly remind himself to stay true to the music, to stay true to the person he was before all this fame. As the show went on, something changed. The energy in the room was electric. The crowd was with him every step of the way, singing along, clapping and cheering. He began to realize that the crowd wasn't there to judge him. They were there because they believed in him. They were there because they loved the music he made. By the time the final song came around, he was no longer nervous. The fear had melted away, replaced by a sense of belonging. He looked out over the crowd, seeing people singing the words to his songs, their faces lit up with joy. This was why he had started in the first place, to share his music with others, to connect with people through the stories he told in his songs. When the show ended, the applause was deafening. He stood there for a moment, taking it all in, trying to process what had just happened. He had come so far from the man who used to sing on the street corner, hoping someone would stop and listen. Now he was standing on a stage, surrounded by thousands of people who had come just to hear him play. It was a dream come true, but it also felt like a new beginning. The next few weeks were a blur. He was thrown into the world of touring, traveling from city to city, performing in front of new crowds every night. Each show was different, each audience unique, but the one thing that remained the same was the connection he felt with the people who came to hear him. It didn't matter where he was or how big the venue was. The music was always the same, and the feeling of being able to share it with others was something he would never take for granted. But the road to success wasn't without its challenges. There were moments when the man felt exhausted, both physically and mentally. The constant travel, the long hours in the studio, the pressure to keep up with the demands of his newfound fame, it all began to wear on him. He missed the simplicity of his old life, the quiet moments when he could sit on the street corner and play without any expectations. There were days when he questioned if all of this was worth it. The stage was incredible, but it was also lonely. The crowds cheered, the cameras flashed, but it didn't feel the same as the small moments he had experienced before. Those moments when he was playing just for the joy of it, not for anyone else's approval. One evening, after a particularly grueling show, the man sat alone in his dressing room. He was tired, physically drained, and mentally exhausted. The adrenaline from the show had worn off, leaving him with a deep sense of emptiness. He had achieved his dreams, but now that he was living them, he wasn't sure what to do next. The world had opened up to him, but it felt like there was still something missing. It was then that he realized what he needed. He needed to reconnect with his roots. He needed to remember why he started this journey in the first place: the music, the connection, the pure joy of sharing a song with others. He didn't want to lose that. He couldn't lose that. The next day, instead of heading straight to the next show, he took a different path. He found a quiet spot in the city, just a small street corner where he used to play. It was different now. There were more people, more noise, but it felt familiar. He set up his guitar, just like he had so many times before, and began to play. At first, there were only a few people who stopped to listen, but that didn't matter. It was enough. He sang the songs he had written years ago, the ones that had started it all. He poured his heart into each note, just as he had on those early mornings when no one was listening. For a moment he was just a man with a guitar, sharing his music with anyone who cared to stop and listen. It was in that moment that he realized something important. It wasn't the stage or the fame that mattered. It was the music, the connection and the joy of creating something that was true to him. The stage might have been bigger, but this street corner was where it all began. And no matter where he went, no matter how far he traveled, he would always carry that piece of himself with him. The next night, he took the stage again, but this time, something had changed. He was no longer overwhelmed by the lights or the size of the crowd. He had found his balance. The music was still the most important thing, and he wasn't going to let the pressures of fame take that away. As he sang, he felt a deeper connection with the audience than he ever had before. He wasn't just performing for them. He was sharing something real with them. And as the crowd cheered, he smiled to himself, knowing that no matter where his journey took him, he would never forget the man who sang on the street, and the people who had stopped to listen. As the man's career continued to grow, he found himself in a whirlwind of success. The bright lights of the stage had become a familiar sight, and the crowds that had once intimidated him now felt like a natural part of his life. His music had resonated with so many people, and the songs he once played alone on the street corner were now filling arenas, being sung by thousands of voices. Yet, despite all the fame and excitement, something was still missing. The man often found himself reflecting on the early days, the days when he was just a guy with a guitar, singing for anyone who would listen. The moments when he played for just a handful of people, when the music was pure and without expectation. It had been simpler then. The connection with his audience had been immediate and real. He had sung not for money or recognition, but for the sheer joy of it. And now, in the chaos of his success, he longed to find that same feeling again. One evening, after a concert in a city that felt more like a blur than a memory, he took a walk alone through the quiet streets. The lights of the city glowed brightly around him, but they felt distant, as if he was seeing the world through a window rather than living in it. The crowds had left the venue, and the excitement of the show had faded. He wasn't sure what he was searching for, but something inside of him told him he needed to be alone for a while, away from the noise. As he walked, he passed a small park. It was quiet, almost deserted, and the familiar hum of the city felt distant here. It reminded him of the old days, before the fame, when he would find moments of peace in places like this, playing his guitar for no one but himself. He paused for a moment, looking at the empty bench beneath the trees, and a thought crossed his mind. What if he could find that sense of peace again, without the pressure of performing for a crowd? What if he could return to the music that had started it all? The raw, honest music he had shared with strangers on the street. The man sat down on the bench, pulling out his guitar from its case. He didn't know what he was looking for, but as his fingers touched the strings, the familiar rhythm began to take over. The song he played was one he hadn't sung in years, a song that had come to him during one of his darkest times. It was a song about hope, about pushing through the hardest days, and about the belief that there was always something better on the other side. It was the kind of song he had written when he had nothing but his music to hold on to. As he sang, his voice was softer than it had been on stage. There was no need to project or perform for an audience. There was only the music and the quiet night around him. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a deep sense of peace wash over him. The world around him faded away, and all that mattered was the music and the feeling it gave him. It wasn't about the applause or the fame. It was about remembering who he was and why he started singing in the first place. He didn't know how long he had been there when a few people began to stop and listen. At first it was just one or two, then more. Some were passing by. Others seemed to be drawn in by the sound of the music. The man didn't stop playing. He simply let the music carry him, sharing it with the few who had gathered around. After a while, the crowd had grown, and the man paused for a moment to catch his breath. He smiled to himself, realizing that once again, the music had done its magic. It didn't matter that the audience was small. What mattered was that they were listening, and they were hearing him in the same way he had once sung for the people on the street corner. There was no pressure, no expectation, just the pure connection between the music and the listener. As the night wore on, the man continued to play, lost in the moment. He didn't know how many people had gathered by then, but it didn't matter. He was back where he belonged, sharing his music with people who were there for the right reasons. There was no rush, no hurry. The music was the only thing that mattered. The next morning, as he walked back to his hotel, the man felt different. It was as if the weight of the world had lifted off his shoulders. He was ready to face the next show, the next city, and whatever came next in his career. But he had found something important that night in the park. He had found the reason he started this journey in the first place. It wasn't for the fame, the recognition, or the applause. It was for the connection, the raw, real connection that music could create. He took a deep breath as he walked through the busy streets, the sounds of the city filling his ears. There was a calmness in him now, a sense of understanding that he hadn't had before. He knew that no matter how big his career became, he would never forget where he came from. He would never forget the street corner where it all started, the moments when he sang just for the joy of it, with no one but a few strangers listening. His journey had taken him to places he had never imagined, but he wasn't going to let it change who he was. The man had learned that success wasn't about how many people were listening or how many records he sold. It was about staying true to himself, to the music, and to the people who had believed in him from the very beginning. The next few years were filled with more success, more tours and more albums, but the man never lost sight of what mattered most. He continued to return to small venues, to street corners, to quiet parks where he could just play for himself and the few people who happened to be around. And as his fame grew, so did his ability to connect with others in a deeper way. His songs became anthems for people who had once been overlooked, just like he had been. His music touched hearts, telling stories of struggle, hope, and resilience, reminding everyone who listened that they were not alone. But no matter how many people filled the stadiums or bought his albums, the man always remembered that it was on those quiet streets, under the soft glow of the streetlights, that he had truly found his voice. And that, he knew, was the most important thing of all. As the years passed, the man's career continued to soar. He had become more than just a street performer or a small-time artist. He was a household name. His music was everywhere, on the radio, in movies, and in the hearts of millions. He had played in the largest arenas and had seen his albums climb the charts. But despite all of this, he still couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to be done, more to give. There were moments when he questioned what it all meant. Was it the fame he truly wanted, or was it the connection? Was he just a product of the industry, being shaped by the demands of fans and record labels? Or was he still the same person who had once played for a few strangers on a street corner? He had never imagined that success could feel so lonely. The stage was bright, but it often felt like he was just going through the motions, performing the same songs night after night. He missed the raw energy of those early days, when the music had no expectations, when it was just him, his guitar, and whoever happened to stop and listen. One afternoon, while taking a break between rehearsals, the man walked outside the studio to clear his mind. The city was bustling as usual, but today it felt different. He couldn't quite place it, but something about the crowd, the noise, and the movement around him made him feel disconnected. He had everything he could have ever wanted: fame, recognition, and a life that most people would envy. But it didn't feel as fulfilling as he had imagined. As he walked through the streets, he found himself in front of a familiar park. It was a place he had walked past countless times during his years in the city, but today it stopped him in his tracks. Something about the quiet beauty of the space called to him. Without thinking, he stepped into the park and walked to a small bench beneath a tree. He sat down, his guitar resting at his side. The quiet was a relief. It had been so long since he had allowed himself to simply be still. The noise of the world, the constant movement, the expectations, the flashing lights had become overwhelming. Here, in this small corner of the city, he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't experienced in years. The air was cool, the leaves rustled gently in the breeze, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he could breathe. As he sat there, he thought about everything that had brought him to this point. The street corner, the people who had passed by and listened, the video that had gone viral, the emails from talent scouts, the record deals, the tours, the sold-out shows. All of it had come so fast, so unexpectedly. And yet, here he was, sitting on a bench in a park, feeling lost. His mind drifted back to those first moments when he had played on the street, just for the joy of it. He hadn't cared about becoming famous or getting paid. He had played because it was what made him feel alive. The thought of how far he had come was both thrilling and frightening. How had he let go of that simple joy? He pulled out his guitar and began to strum a few chords. The familiar feeling of the strings beneath his fingers brought him some comfort. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the music fill his thoughts. He wasn't thinking about the stage or the crowds or the expectations, he was just playing. For the first time in a long time, he felt connected to the music again. A few minutes passed before he noticed a person sitting nearby, quietly watching him play. The man didn't stop, not at first. He continued to play the song, his voice soft and steady. As he finished, he looked up and smiled at the stranger, who had been quietly listening. The person, an older man with kind eyes, nodded in approval. "That was beautiful," the man said, his voice warm but not overly eager. "You play with a lot of heart?" The man nodded, feeling a sense of relief. "Thank you," he replied. "It's been a while since I've just played for myself." The older man smiled and sat a little closer. "Sometimes we get caught up in what everyone else expects. It's easy to forget why we do things in the first place." The man didn't know what to say at first. The stranger's words resonated with him in a way he hadn't expected. It was as if he had spoken the truth he had been avoiding. "Yeah," he said slowly. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately." The older man chuckled softly. "You're not the first, but the important thing is that you've remembered. The music is yours, not anyone else's. It's easy to lose sight of that." For the first time in a long while, the man felt a sense of clarity. He had been running from something. He had been chasing success, fame, and recognition without ever asking himself why. He had been so caught up in the whirlwind of his career that he had forgotten what had made him pick up a guitar in the first place. The two sat in silence for a while, the man playing softly as the older man listened. After a few songs, the older man stood up, stretched his arms, and smiled. "You've got a gift," he said. "But remember, the best music comes from the heart. Keep that in mind and you'll be fine." The man nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. As the stranger walked away, the man sat there for a few more minutes, lost in his thoughts. He realized that the path he had been on had led him to a place he hadn't expected, a place where he was no longer sure of himself or his music. But now, in this quiet park, he had rediscovered what mattered. The music was his. It always had been. And he needed to remember that. That evening, as he returned to his hotel room, the man picked up his phone and looked through the messages waiting for him. There were requests for interviews, for brand deals, for appearances, and more. His manager had already sent him a schedule for the next few weeks, packed with events and shows. It was overwhelming. But this time, he didn't feel that same rush of excitement he once had. Instead, he felt a calmness, a sense of balance. The man knew that he had to find a way to keep the joy in the music, even as his career grew. He couldn't let the pressures of fame dictate who he was or what he created. He needed to stay true to himself, to the music that had brought him here. The next day, he made a decision. He would still tour, still perform, but he would do it on his own terms. He would take time for the small moments, the quiet times when he could just play for himself away from the spotlight. And when he did perform for his fans, he would remember why he started in the first place: to share the music, to connect, and to inspire. Not for the applause, not for the fame, but for the music itself. He started to schedule breaks in between his tours, time to visit small towns, to play in quiet parks, to return to the roots of his music. And when he took the stage, he was no longer just a performer. He was an artist, someone who had learned the value of staying true to his heart. The crowd still cheered, still sang along, but now he played with a different energy. He played for the love of it, for the connection, and for the reminder that no matter how far he went, he would always carry the heart of the street corner with him. As his career continued to grow, the man found a new sense of peace. He was no longer chasing something external. He had found his purpose again in the quiet moments and the simple joy of playing music. And in the end, that was all he had ever needed. The man's journey had come full circle. From the street corners to sold-out arenas, from the quiet moments of self-doubt to the exhilaration of performing for thousands, he had experienced it all. But through it all, one thing remained clear. The music was always what mattered most. After years of fame, he had finally found the balance he had been searching for. He had learned how to stay true to his roots, how to reconnect with the joy that had first drawn him to the guitar. The pressures of the industry were still there, but they no longer defined him.
He had discovered the key to his happiness. He didn't need to perform for validation, and he didn't need the spotlight to feel fulfilled.
His music had become an expression of who he was, not who the world expected him to be. One day, while on a break between shows, the man found himself sitting on the porch of a small cafe in a quiet town he had never been to before. It was a place far removed from the chaos of city life, with trees lining the street and the sound of birds chirping in the distance. The calmness of the place reminded him of the park where he had rediscovered his love for music all those months ago. He smiled as he took in the peaceful surroundings, knowing that he had come a long way from the uncertainty he once felt. As he sat there, sipping his coffee, a young woman approached him. She was carrying a guitar case, and as she neared, she looked hesitant. The man raised his eyebrows, wondering if she had recognized him. She smiled shyly before speaking. "Excuse me," she began. "I don't mean to interrupt, but I just wanted to say that your music has meant a lot to me." The man smiled back, a little surprised. He wasn't used to being approached so casually. "Thank you," he said warmly. "I'm glad my music has touched you." The young woman hesitated for a moment, looking down at her guitar. "I'm just starting out," she said quietly. "I've been playing on my own for a while, but I don't know where to go next. I've been thinking about playing for others, but I'm scared." The man could see the uncertainty in her eyes. He recognized it immediately, the same doubt that he had felt all those years ago. "I understand," he said gently. "When I first started, I had no idea what would come of it. I just played because it was something I loved. And sometimes that's enough." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with hope and hesitation. "But what if I fail? What if no one listens?" The man thought for a moment, remembering his own journey. "You might fail," he said softly. "But that doesn't mean it's the end. Everyone starts somewhere. The key is to keep playing, keep sharing your music. You don't need anyone's approval to know that what you're doing is worth it." The woman smiled, the weight of her doubts lifting just a little. "Thank you," she said quietly before turning to leave. But then she paused and looked back at him. "Do you mind if I play something for you?" The man's heart warmed at her courage. "Of course," he said, nodding. "I'd love to hear it." She sat down on the bench next to him and opened her guitar case. For a few moments she adjusted the strings and took a deep breath. Then she began to play. The song was simple but beautiful, filled with raw emotion. It wasn't perfect. The notes were a little uneven and her voice trembled slightly, but it was real. It was the kind of song that came from the heart, the kind of song that the man knew was the most important kind of music. As she finished, the man clapped softly. "That was wonderful," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "You've got something special." The young woman smiled shyly, looking down at her guitar. "Thank you," she whispered. "It means a lot to hear that from you." For a moment, they both sat in silence, the sounds of the world around them fading away. The man felt a sense of fulfillment wash over him. This was why he had started this journey in the first place. Not for the fame, not for the accolades, but for the connection, for the music, and for the chance to inspire others. As the woman packed up her guitar and walked away, the man sat back watching her go. He realized that the circle was complete. He had come from the street sharing his music with anyone who would listen, and now he was able to pass that gift on to someone else. It wasn't about being the biggest or the best. It was about sharing the music and inspiring others to do the same. He returned to his tour, but this time something had shifted. He wasn't just performing for the crowds, he was performing for the love of it. He had learned to embrace the quiet moments, to find peace in the simple act of playing music. The pressure to be everything to everyone had melted away. Now when he stood on stage, he didn't think about the applause or the fame. He thought about the connection he was creating with the people in the audience. He thought about the girl with the guitar, the one who had asked him for advice, and he knew that in some way his journey had come full circle. The man continued to play, continued to tour, and continued to share his music. But now each song felt different. Each note carried with it the weight of all the lessons he had learned, the people he had met, and the moments of doubt that had shaped him. He was no longer just a performer. He was an artist, a teacher, and a friend. And most importantly, he was at peace with who he was and what he had become. As he looked out at the sea of faces in the crowd, he no longer saw them as strangers. He saw them as fellow travelers, each of them on their own journey, each of them seeking the same thing: connection, meaning, and the joy of being understood. And as the man sang, he knew that no matter where life took him, the music would always be there waiting to carry him home.